All right, so let's take a 15-minute break. Everybody kind of sits back here at noon, and hopefully Sharon will be on, and Julie will introduce her, and then we can.
This morning, which seems like a long, long time ago, Sharon Dinwiddie is a huge star in the field of science communication and environmental communication. And she's long time been a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in journalism and mass comm. She's the author of several books, author or editor of several books on science and environmental communication, including the first one that goes back further than I will mention the copyright date, Science and Journalists. And she's just pretty much the leader in the field for that. So as I said, she's been active in the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's been active in all of our major organizations that are related to teaching communication. And I am proud to say she's my friend. And she tolerates me a couple times a year. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Julie. And hi, everybody. I can see a few of you, and I'm very impressed that there's actually humans on a Zoom meeting at noon on a Saturday. So that's pretty good. And if a large black cat goes floating across the screen, just just ignore him. I'm hoping he's asleep somewhere. So anyway, thank you all for having me to spend some time talking about science journalism. It's one of my passions, and I hope to convince you that it's worth exploring, not necessarily to become a science writer, but there may be students who are interested in this. And I'll mention in a few minutes that I greatly appreciated the encouragement I got from my junior high, remember that term, junior high and high school teachers back in the day. Julie and others encouraged me to tell you my story, and I will do that briefly because I did work as a science journalist for a number of years before going back to school and getting into what I call the professor business. And I'll tell you how that happened, because it was odd only in the, it was odd. And so I'll share that with you. But then I want to move on to some discussion of science journalism today, where these folks are, where they're not anymore, unfortunately, and how people come to do this sort of work. So here we go. No, we won't. Now what? All right, hold on. For some reason, it's not moving. I'm going to go back to, all right, here we go. So one of the most important things I learned when I was finally becoming an adult was the role that chance plays in our lives. I've become a firm believer in chance as a major player in what we all finally accomplish. And I think in terms of training students and in reflecting on my own life, I try to impress people with the importance of chance as an actor, a very important actor in their lives. And my favorite motto is the Louis Pasteur motto: chance favors the prepared mind. So in my view, throughout my career as a teacher, I've been in the business of helping individuals become nimble in the face of chance. And by chance, I don't mean, again, nefarious activities, but things that come along. That Pasteur quote, by the way, is actually a bit longer than chance favors the prepared mind. Here's the official quote in the field. Well, he would say it in French, for those of you who are great with languages. In the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. But again, one of my arguments, and I try to convince students of this, is that things happen in their lives. And the trick to life, I think, is to take advantage of the things that happen. And permit me to demonstrate that with my own uh, introduction to science journalism. I had early on been told that I could write. And for that revelation, I want to thank the junior high and high school teachers that I had, as that's where this important moment often occurs, where one of you says to a student, you know, you're good at this. And I had teachers who said, you're good at this. We want you to edit the student newspaper. We want you to edit the school yearbook. And they convinced me that I could write. So in that sense, my movement, and I decided at that point I wanted to be a journalist. And so there was a kind of planned movement there. What was unplanned was what happened next. I finished a journalism degree at Indiana University and marched out to be a journalist somewhere. I had double majored in journalism and political science because I thought, well, you know, that's what journalists do. They cover politics. I had zero knowledge, well, not zero, but close to zero knowledge about science. Like so many individuals back in the day, my science teachers in high school were fairly uninspiring. And so I came out thinking science was hard, science was uninteresting. Nobody wanted to learn about it. But I did take an astronomy course that actually got me very interested in astronomy. And as a student reporter at Indiana University, I wrote one science story about this. This is a graphic image of a quasar, which quasars were discovered back when I was an undergraduate. That will date me quite dramatically, if you happen to know when that occurred. And these are intense bodies. They tend to be very, very far away, although we can monitor their behavior. And their best guess is that they are really black holes at the center of galaxies far, far away. So here I was, a student journalist. I wrote a story about quasars. Graduated, took off, and as luck would have it, and here's where chance begins to play a role. I moved to Texas and walked into one of the large daily newspapers in Texas the day after the science writer quit. So I can still see the managing editor sitting in his office. I'm on the other side of the desk. He's shuffling through all the stories that I've written. Shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. Sees the quasar story, holds it up, and he says, "Oh," he says, "I see you cover science." And of course, here's where I was smart enough to say, why, yes, I do. So he hired me on the spot to become the science writer for this large daily newspaper in San Antonio. It was called the San Antonio Light, a perfectly horrid newspaper if anybody's from Texas. And well, I think it's now deader than a doornail. It was a Hearst paper. Its singular attribute, there were two singular attributes. It was huge, and it left me alone. And so I could run around the city covering science of all types, from health to veterinary medicine to physics to you name it. And so I became, much to my horror in a way, the science writer for the San Antonio Light. I learned on the job because I do not have a lot of training in science. And that was pretty typical, I learned, in that day and time. Just to date myself quite thoroughly, this was 1969, 1970. And the bottom line is that once I got over my abject terror of going out and interviewing scientists, I absolutely fell in love with this job. You could go out and talk to smart people about fascinating things they were doing. I think I did a really decent job of capturing their meanings and their words. I just loved this job. And I wasn't alone. At about this time, the world of science journalists was burgeoning in the United States. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was the space race back in the, well, really kind of started in the 50s, but heavy in the 60s and 70s, where again, we're having some wonderful documentaries at this point as we celebrate anniversaries of some of the space series that were going on. But newspapers who could have cared less about science for many years suddenly realized in the 60s that science was going to be front page news. And so what they did is they grabbed journalists in the newsroom and said, you are now a science writer, and packed them off to Houston, to Cape Canaveral, to the Jet Propulsion Center in California to cover science. And so suddenly in the 60s, there were a bevy of reporters turned into science journalists out covering some of the most exciting stuff you could imagine. And they loved it. I was hired at, kind of in the middle of all that. Perversely, my newspaper would not, I was in Texas, they wouldn't send me to Houston to cover the space shot. So what I ended up doing, and it was equally fascinating, but also equally horrific, was cover a lot of the health issues that occurred when Vietnam veterans were coming back. We had a lot of medical centers in San Antonio where I was working, and there were many, many stories to do there. But this was a great catalyst, a huge catalyst for hiring science writers in the United States. Another catalyst was 1970s Earth Day, and there's a huge bit of coverage right now. We are wallowing in it here in Wisconsin because we are the progenitors of Earth Day, and have a huge, huge investment in this structure and in the continuing focus on Earth Day with Governor Nelson, Senator Nelson. And we also happen to have Aldo Leopold hanging around early in the 20th century. So it was really a wonderful thing for us. But all of a sudden, environmental reporters became front page news. And a lot of those joined the Corps. Once you got this huge increase in science journalists, you needed places for them to work. And we suddenly got a development of newspaper science sections. The granddaddy of them all is the Science Times on the left of your screen. Started in 1978 and is one of, and I'll get to the sad part of this story, is one of the few remaining newspaper science sections in the country. But again, it was one of, I think at the peak, there may have been between 20 and 30 science sections in newspapers around the country in the United States. This also became an international trend. So there were a lot of news holes for science journalists to fill. Along with that, creation of popular science magazines. Now, there were a number of them already: Popular Science Monthly, Science News, Scientific American liked to call itself a popular magazine, but we always challenged people to actually be able to read the darn thing. But in the 1970s, early 1980s, again, a part of this trend, a whole bunch of popular science magazines emerged. Among them, Omni. These are all, by the way, again, pretty much deader than doornails. Science Digest. These two were small little tab magazines that grew into big ones. And the one on the right, Science 80, this is the premiere issue of a popular science magazine created by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It was probably the best magazine of the bunch. And it too, all of these magazines then folded sometime in the 1980s. And again, could not attain this sort of vigor. So again, it was a wonderful time to be a science journalist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And notice where they all were: print publications. For the most part, there were a few TV science journalists, but by and large, and we're talking, pre social media, pre-internet, these were the places you went if you wanted to be a working journalist. The most popular magazine back then continues to be the most popular science magazine today, and I wonder if anybody knows what it is. Any guesses?
Oh, I subscribe to Scientific America, so I have to say that one.
Oh, good for you, but wrong.
Oh, Stephanie and I, we were wrong.
Now think of a magazine that was sitting in almost every household, stored in gigantic piles in the basement.
National Geographic.
Nat Geo.
Yep, there you go. It has long covered science heavily, often in a rather uninspiring way. Lots of pretty pictures, not a lot of meat. But in recent years, recent decades, it has really bulked up. It's now winning all kinds of science journalism awards. Perversely, it is owned by Fox, or by the Murdoch family, of which worried us enormously when Murdoch bought National Geographic. On the other hand, it's being run by a couple of the Murdoch kids. One of them is a true believer of science and issues of evidence, and that's who is really running the show here for National Geographic. So again, there are popular science magazines around today still. Science News remains viable. Discover, which did get started in the 70s, has hung in there across multiple owners, is now owned by a kind of cheap publisher, Kalmbach, happens to be in Milwaukee. They're still at it, but so these are some of the few that are still with us. And at that time, again, remember in the 60s and 70s, and I'm a good example of this, you didn't have a science background to become a science journalist. They wanted a good journalist, and you would turn into a science journalist. Today, that is beginning to change. There are many, actually quite a few, science journalism programs around the country. Sometimes they're individual courses, sometimes they're certificate programs, sometimes they're entire master's degrees, mostly housed in journalism programs around the country. But again, there's a huge emphasis in these programs now on bringing scientists in. So science students, or in some cases, PhD scientists. There are some programs like the program at UC Santa Cruz that will only look at your application if you've been a practicing scientist for a few years. And so today's science journalists have a heavy, I think, formal training in science. This is a paper that I wrote a few years ago. I began to be curious as a science journalism teacher about what the ideal background for a science journalist might be. And there isn't a big literature on that. There isn't a lot of research, and most of the research that exists looks at the knowledge base that science journalists have, and then tries to see if certain demographic factors predict to the more knowledgeable journalist. It turns out the best predictor of a highly knowledgeable science journalist, at least with these rather meager studies, is the number of years you've worked as a science journalist, not your formal education, but again, the length of time you put in doing this kind of work. That's not an unusual predictor for a lot of areas of expertise. It is also our guess, though, that journalists who are at entry level really do benefit from science training as they walk in with the tools the ability to understand how science happens. At least we hope they do. So again, I think there are benefits to formal science training. But when you look at science writing programs now around the country, you see a heavy investment in individuals who are coming out of the sciences. Once we got to the 2000s, and once the internet became a dominant feature of our information gathering portfolio, you find a rather serious decline in science journalism, in science journalists, I should say. And there are a number of reasons for this. One harks back to what I said earlier, that the primary homes for science journalists worldwide were print organizations, typically magazines and newspapers. Once the internet age began and the advertising bottom fell out for those print organizations, it has become harder and harder for science journalists to be present in these kinds of traditional sites. I go to an annual science meeting every year that used to attract 400 to 500 science journalists. And I watched over the years as their name tags went from saying the Washington Post, the Cincinnati Enquirer, Science News, to freelance. They were being cut loose. They're passionate about what they do. They weren't willing to give up on the science journalism part, but it became increasingly difficult for science journalists to make a living. And today we are in a world where there are a few wonderful homes for science journalists. And in fact, some of the legacy media still remain dominant employers of science journalists. I'm thinking of the New York Times, some of the dominant magazines like Scientific American, and others. But what we see in the modern age are individuals now beginning to adapt as best they can to this new media environment. And I think they're doing a very good job of it, but it creates a far more complex world for science journalists. When I talk to students about becoming, and I still, although I'm now retired, up until the point I retired, I was still filling a science journalism class with young, bright individuals, some of them science students, some of them out of other majors who wanted to do this. And it causes one to think about what you need now in order to flourish as a science journalist today. And the list I've come up with and that I share with them is not unlike what you would see in the world in other specialty areas for journalists today, but I thought I would share some of those with you. One is you really now need serious analytical and interpretive skills. The days of covering, breaking news is still very much the domain of journalists, and particularly in internet channels, there's a strong focus on breaking news. We all attend to feeds that inform us, and that happens within the world of science journalism too. But there's a sharp turn in journalism, which I appreciate. Actually, I think it's really critical, to writing more analytical pieces, more interpretive pieces, to take what's going on in the world and helping readers, viewers, listeners understand why these things are happening, understand what to make of them. And you have seen a lot of this work, although you probably weren't paying attention to who was generating it, when all through the course of the pandemic, when we're all riveted on information sources, we're seeking information, and you're seeing a lot of this analytical and interpretive stuff. Science journalists have morphed into very skillful analytical writers. They are building statistical skills. They're building the ability to work with big data. They're coming to understand the perils of both of those things, and they're generating stories that I think make a huge impact on audiences. Another big need now is storytelling savvy. You have to be able to go in as a science journalist and rivet your reader, viewer, listener, help that person get caught up in the story. Some of you, I'm sure, have read just absolutely fascinating pieces on a whole variety of topics. This is a skill, and it's a skill that can be learned. It has to be practiced, and many journalists, as do other writers, develop particular styles to bring this along. It takes years to develop, I think, storytelling savvy. It takes a lot of practice, and that again is another reason why I think more experienced journalists tend to be better at this than others. But again, very important these days to make your way as a science journalist. Clearly, the ability to work across platforms, both legacy platforms and online platforms. Entry level now for science journalists, as for most journalists, tends to be a website, or beginning to pitch stories to the websites of legacy media channels, or literally online sites. And so training, you need to be able to manage this. You need to be able to know how to tell a story in an online format, in an online channel. It's different from that ability in more straightforward legacy channels. Some of us have studied those things. For example, if someone's reading, let's say, a newspaper or a magazine story, what they do is they read sequentially, move linearly through that text. If you give them a knowledge quiz after they've read that text, they know a little about a lot of the pieces of the text. Okay, if they see that same text in an online channel, they go jumping like gazelles from one piece to another. They ignore parts of the story. They focus on others. If you give them a knowledge test in that mode, it turns out they know a lot about a few things, a few dimensions of the story. Very different ways of coming to understand what somebody has written. And journalists and other writers need to be savvy about crafting information that's ideal for the channel. And it's no longer okay to assume you come out as a writer and get a job somewhere. As I say, many very highly skilled journalists are now working as freelancers with all of the problems that entails, particularly pronounced at this point, because again, they're self-employed, many of them. So they need to develop entrepreneurial skills in order to be able to pitch ideas, market stories, and market the books that they write as well. So it's a very different world from the world that I inhabited back in the early 1970s. I wanted to show you a few wonderful takes on good writing. I'm just going to throw up a few of these and then subside and let you hope to have sort of a conversation about science journalism, both the good and the bad. These are just a few stories I haphazardly picked, but they also are places where one can go. One of my favorite writers is a guy by the name of Ed Yong. He was never trained as a science writer. He was a scientist. I think he was working in the UK for many years, and he just started a blog. And in his blog, he would take a peer-reviewed science article and explain it for everyday people. He's one of the few writers whose blog suddenly caught the attention of a lot of other journalists. And Ed moved to the U.S. He now lives in the U.S. He's now works for The Atlantic, is a part of their online staff, and his work is getting an enormous amount of attention. He's a highly skilled writer, and this particular story, Our Pandemic Summer, is a recent story, April 14. Again, like it's very analytical. It looks at what we all can expect as we look ahead in this world we now inhabit. There are other wonderfully analytical pieces about this. Of course, everywhere you turn, you're finding interpretive analytical stories. The New York Times is doing wonderful work, putting out tranches of stories, looking analytically at what to expect. But I think Ed is getting a lot of attention for this particular story, and he'll be writing additional stories. He's been covering the pandemic since it got started. But again, a scientist turned science journalist who is doing very well. Just another example, and Julie will appreciate this. This is a story that was in the New York Times Sunday Magazine. Robin Marantz Hennig is a veteran science writer. She may well be president of a group called the National Association of Science Writers right now, or she soon will be. And this is, again, a story about an individual who tried to plan for her death. It required almost an anthropological approach by Robin. Again, it's loaded with science, but the storytelling builds the science in ways that it's almost seamless. You don't know that you're learning about Alzheimer's. You don't know that you're learning about the ways in which people study an intractable illness like that. You're following the life of a person, and it's just an incredible piece. I think Julie uses it a lot in her classes. And again, there are others like that. In fact, I will show you one more here. This is a few years old, but it's long been one of my, no, let's not do that. Speaking of analytical text, there's a great site, 538. If you haven't found it yet, it's well worth your time and attention. They cover a variety of topics online, a solely online journalistic site, and they focus heavily on analytical stories. Their journalists have to be good at understanding a whole variety of evidence-based processes. And here's just an example from that. They tackle a particular issue that they think their readers will care about. Why are some young, healthy people getting severe COVID-19? Incidentally, COVID-19 is the disease, not the virus. I had to learn that myself. So COVID-19. So why are some people really getting sick and others not so much? It's a short but fascinating piece, but it's heavily focused on communicating to the reader that scientists do not yet know the answer to this question. And again, the ability to communicate uncertainty while telling a good story is a skill that many science journalists have had to learn. I love their work. Another great analytical site is called STAT, S-T-A-T. That's all about health. And so you can follow a lot of health issues there. There are some internet sites that truly are high quality. A site called Inside Climate News actually won a Pulitzer Prize. That's the top prize in journalism a couple of years ago for their coverage of an oil spill in Michigan. So again, very analytical, I think extraordinarily good work. but the one that has remained with me, I showed you Julie's favorite. This has remained my favorite for several years now, is Snowfall, New York Times piece about a deadly avalanche that killed several highly skilled skiers. These were not people who were just out on a lark. They knew what they were doing, and it still didn't help. What I love about Snowfall, you can find it on the New York Times site, is, again, it's also part of a genre that is increasingly popular and important, a kind of multimedia presentation. You can read the hard copy. If you go online, you'll get not only text, but video, graphics, all tracking what happened over the course of 24 hours as a group of skiers went up to what they thought would be a safe opportunity to go skiing. And in the process, you learn a lot about snow, about avalanches. So again, this is what if I could go back and have a second life as a science journalist, this is the kind of stuff I would like to do. In order to do it, I'd have to find a job at some kind of outlet that has the resources to let me accomplish this. Not easy these days, but again, I'm thrilled that we have students who continue to be interested in being science journalists. And as you work with your own students, we would be thrilled to find young people coming up with that interest as well. I think this stuff is so important to know. These journalists do such good work in helping us understand complicated stuff, that the more of them we have, the more of them who can find ways to share that information with us, the better. So with that, I will stop. And thank you for not falling asleep. But open to any reactions you have or questions about the business of science journalism that we can talk about.
Thank you, Sharon. Could you, as just a way to help facilitate the discussion, could you stop your screen share? And then we can kind of make everybody bigger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, before we get started, let me just say there were a handful of you all that left your cameras on over lunch. And in case you walked back and you didn't want to be seen eating, I just turned your camera off. But there's a chance that means you can't turn your camera back on. So if that's the case and you want your camera on, send me a note in the chat and I will take care of it. But Christy Ridley had a question. Yeah. Actually, she had two. If Christy wants to go ahead and unmute herself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just very curious. Something that I've been struggling with recently is how there seems to be such a great distrust of science in our society. And I just wanted to know what you thought, where that's coming from, and what we can do about that.
That's a really good question. Thank you. It's hard to pin it down. On the one hand, if you do, there have been decades of surveys of the American public looking at our respect for occupations. What occupations do we value? And while journalists don't rate very high, nor do politicians, way up on the scale for decades have been scientists and physicians. They still sit at the top of the food chain. When they do these surveys, and you can find these, for example, the National Science Foundation puts out periodic publications that collect these data. It's called Science and Engineering Indicators. You can find them. But again, so on the one hand, science remains one of the most highly respected ways of knowing of any in American society. On the other hand, the the trend for all occupational groups, trust in all occupational groups, has been going down.
Mhm.
It's stabilized now, and so I don't know if that decline will continue. But again, you're right to make the point that trust in science, judgments of credibility in science have declined. What causes that depends on the researcher whose work you examine. One argument that I find somewhat persuasive is that, again, science has become politicized in many ways. You can sort of count on your fingers the kinds of issues that were once scientific issues, but now have become so politicized that the best predictor of how you think about that science issue is ideology, not how much you know about science. Vaccines and autism is one good example, and I'm afraid COVID-19 is another. In fact, I was shocked at how rapidly that science issue was politicized in American culture. So there are, one argument is that, and if something about science becomes politicized, climate change, gosh, there are so many, we immediately step away from considering an evidence-based view and harbor with our ideological fans and friends. And of course, as we've seen in the course of this COVID pandemic, that's pretty dangerous, frankly. I mean, there was just a demonstration in Madison, where I live. About 1,500 people came out yesterday. It's happening elsewhere in the country, of course, to claim that we are, that the stay-at-home orders are infringing on their personal freedom, which turns out to be correct. But this total abrogation of any responsibility for the collective good is scary and ideological, not science-based. So again, what's causing this decline, and other scholars have argued that the more we actually know about science and how scientists come to know things, the more critical we are. A kind of natural progression. If you know that how scientists do research, I'm a social scientist, so if you know how social scientists do research, you approach any of our peer-reviewed articles with thoughtful caution, because the way we measure things, the way we look for causality is challenging. So another argument is the more we know, the more critical we become. That said, though, I remain reasonably comfortable that most Americans value, trust science, trust physicians, and that again, they remain at the top of the heap. And I think we're sort of seeing that with the COVID pandemic.
I'd also kind of want to throw on that the fact that it's easy to identify things that go wrong and be like, well, it didn't work in this one area. And so, as soon as somebody messes up, that's when science trust starts to go down. And right. It's really, really hard to bring, it's trust, right? So with any relationship that an individual has, once trust is broken, it's really hard to get it back. And then the other thing is, there's not a lot of people who know a scientist. Right. And so you trust more of who you know and who's in your community. And so that's why, this program I think is great. I think the Skype a Scientist program is great. So basically people are starting to, see the diversity of scientists and just the different things that we have to do to get to the answers.
Right. I couldn't agree more. It's, we've been involved in looking at how people make risk judgments about risky things, and trust in sources once broken is almost impossible to get back. Yeah. It's really, it's very difficult. Michael, shall I stare at my chat screen?
Yeah.
Okay. I see some stuff up there, but I didn't want to abrogate your interaction.
No, not at all. Diane Humphrey had a couple of questions, but I think her internet is acting up, so she asked me if I could read them. So you just briefly mentioned peer-reviewed papers. So Diane's curious about how important peer-reviewed papers are because she doesn't think that the general public understands what that means, but most scientists really only respect other peer-reviewed papers.
Yes, and the concept of peer review has been a time-honored component of truth claims in science. Again, the more you know about peer review, the more the more cautious you are about the validity of things that find their way into print anyway. But peer review is I think a genuinely good idea. And indeed, I don't think the public is all that well versed in what peer review is and why it happens. Science journalists have tended, and I don't want to say this about all of them, but they've tended to respect peer review. They have, when they talk to a scientist, when they cover new research, and that still remains a big part of their bailiwick, they tend to step up once peer review has taken place and an article is destined for a journal. Some journals, in fact, will punish scientists if they talk to journalists before peer review has taken place, which is to say, if you talk to journalists about your work and then you submit an article to the New England Journal of Medicine, the journal may say, not on a bet, you've already spoken to somebody, we're not even going to touch it. So a lot of scientists actually won't talk, tend not to talk publicly about their work until it has been through peer review. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon that's going on. It started in physics, it's now moved over into medicine, and these are, there are websites that allow scientists to post their work before they send it off for peer review at a journal. They still intend to do that with that research, but they post it in order to give other scientists a preview of what they're doing and to get feedback that might help them revise their paper. It's been a wonderful, I guess, opportunity for many scientists, again, mainly in the physical scientists, but now in the health and medical sciences, there are these sites where you can post. And I was just reading the other day that everyday people are now going to these sites and grabbing stuff off of them. And again, this is all before the work has been vetted. And there is some concern at this point that people will begin to use this material, some of which is bad science, okay? Some of it is, will begin to use it before it has actually been vetted by other scientists. Some of these sites are now putting markers on the articles saying, you know, this has not been peer reviewed, but I'm not sure what kind of weight that will carry to folks who are less concerned about that process.
Yeah, I love the preprints. So I just put in the chat, you know, the link to the COVID-19 preprints. So as scientists are working on COVID-19 right now, they're sharing their science as soon as possible. One of the reasons why I like this is because it facilitates faster science, so that when somebody posts this, the scientific community reads it and they will just go right at it right then and there. And the comment section will be full of scientists, you know, like, this is what you should have done and this is what could be done next. And, you know, new science can then quickly happen from that. Right. But like, yeah, like you said, the vetting of it isn't quite there yet.
Right. Well, yeah, they and again, as long as this was the sort of province of fellow scientists, I think people were quite happy about it. But there are now some examples of, because this is open to anyone, there are examples of individuals going in and cherry picking things that fit their belief systems. There's that ideological issue again, and going with it. So it'll be interesting to see how we all cope with this enormous amount of information.
And it looks like we're getting a lot of positive comments about two of the folks involved with the U.S. response to the coronavirus and COVID-19 with Fauci and Birx as well.
Mm-hmm. And good for all the commenters. I mean, they're the two evidence-based souls in the room for these daily briefings. I don't know about you, but I've just had to stop watching these briefings. I can't do it. But what I do is I pick up. I get the gist of the briefings both from the PBS NewsHour and from my next morning's New York Times, which I still get in hard copy, I must say, delivered to my door. But Fauci and Birx indeed are the two sane characters there. And I appreciate the fact that people value their input.
And Diane had another follow-up question. With all the people touting things either as fake news or something is fake news, how do we ourselves, and maybe thinking also about our students, how do we teach people how to recognize something that is obviously, maybe to you is not true, but maybe to someone who doesn't have your science background?
Looks like it's true. Yeah, this is across all content areas now, not just science, has become a major area. I would say there are communication scholars who are studying both the construction of fake news and our use or ability to weed it out. So there's a lot of fascinating research right now that's looking at this. It's hard to know how to help individuals evaluate this. Part of the problem is that fake news is being used to strengthen belief systems. And again, use of fake news or use of news that in science simply isn't true is much more likely, the uptake is much more likely among individuals with extremely strong belief systems that don't allow them to view the news they see on Fox, Breitbart, etc., as an illusion, as something that's not true. I will say that many journalism organizations have stepped up to the plate and are now assessing the validity of information. They never used to do this. I mean, back in the day, if you were a journalist, your job wasn't to say, boy, scientists, you just lied. How dare you? We couldn't do that as writers. But now what you'll see are routinely efforts to evaluate the validity of information. Certainly that wasn't terribly difficult when our president came out with his disinfectant comments the other day. But there are lots of other instances of information that once evaluated is offered up as incorrect, false. The New York Times and others are even using the word lie, L-I-E, meaning verb, not lie down, but and again, I've appreciated as a reader the increased focus on helping to determine what's fake and what isn't. But sites that are interested in persuasion, not so much in validity, are becoming very sophisticated. It's now possible, as you know, I'm sure, to create videos where somebody like Anthony Fauci literally appears to be saying something that he never said. And I think the sophistication now of our ability to create information that looks genuine, particularly online, is really going to ramp up, and we're going to have to be incredibly thoughtful about this. I tend to try to triangulate across media channels. If I see something in one channel, I go looking in another channel. These have to be channels I respect. So, but I go look in another channel to see if that channel is providing the same message.
What do you mean by channel, real quick?
Thank you for asking. Yeah. Channels, I distinguish between channels and sources. Channels are the conveyors of information. So the New York Times is a channel. Fox News is a channel. A blog is a channel. A source, on the other hand, is an individual whose meanings are conveyed in that channel. So a story in the New York Times may have several sources embedded in that story. So if you're watching the daily briefings, I admire your courage, by the way, if you're doing that. If you're watching the daily briefings, the channel is, depending on where you're getting it, if you're watching on television, the channel is television. The sources are Fauci et al. So that's the distinction I make. And I think it's an important distinction because it turns out you and I, because we tend to make decisions about credibility and trust rapidly, we tend not to make judgments about sources. Rather, we make judgments about channels. So I do this, and I think you all do too. If it shows up in the New York Times, I think it's probably accurate, okay? I view the New York Times as a credible channel. Now, I will take a look at sources, and if our very, very orange president is one of them, I immediately become skeptical of the truth claims that he's making. So we do that. But in general, we tend to, this is called sort of satisficing. We tend to make judgments about channels and not about sources. And it's important, I think, when you're interested in fake news to pick, if you do this, and I do, to pick the channels that are most likely to hand over accurate information. So I read The Atlantic, I read The New Yorker, I read The New York Times, PBS NewsHour. I don't pay a lot of attention to national TV news or to local TV news. I frankly don't think they are I don't understand half of what they're saying, frankly. I can't derive meanings from what they're doing. So we all do this. We pick channels, and again, that's probably how we're going to explore our fake news savvy.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just throw something? I'd really like to make a plug for the radio program and podcast On the Media.
Yep.
They run on a lot of national public radio stations, but you can also get them online. It's what is it? onthemedia.org, and they analyze every week. They choose a different topic to go really in depth on, but you can get tons of really good information about sources and channels, etc. From On the Media, and they're very entertaining too.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, very good.
I think one of the things, just to kind of keep the conversation about the trust with science and the trust with news writers, there has been some kind of distrust that has occurred between scientists and science writers, and that happened, even with myself. So where I do a bad job conveying my science to somebody, and then they write it, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, this is not what I intended. I did not mean this or that. And so it's all about those relationships too that kind of come out with it, and recognizing. So like for me, I have somebody at the Knoxville News Sentinel that I trust 100% when she's writing about my science, and I appreciate it when she reaches out to me and says, hey, can we do a piece on lacrosse, or on the ticks in the area or something. And I don't even like review it anymore, because I can send her sources and I can send her information, and I know it's going to be fantastic. I'm going to do a real quick share screen. One of the things that's super important, in my opinion, and I think a lot of scientists are saying this now too, is the value of the science writer, which I think, Dr. Dunwoody, you kind of mentioned where, things were like this, and, we're kind of like this. And I think now we're starting to see that we need one another to succeed in both of our fields. And so as a part, so I'm a member of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. They have really good connections with WHO and the Gates Foundation, the CDC, military personnel around the world, not just US, but other countries. So this society actually created a specific communications award having to do with health impacts. And this has been around now for a long time. And I'll put this link in the chat, and then Michael will put it into the I guess like the Word document or Google Doc he's creating out of all of this. But it is like, these are some really great pieces that our society now recognizes and is giving awards for this, that I don't think a lot of science societies typically do. And so there's combating malaria over here, breaking the cycle, the fly factory in Ethiopia. I'm kind of pointing out the entomology ones if you haven't noticed yet. But you can see that started in 2005, right around that same time period that Dr. Dunwoody was talking about. And so, I think these pieces could be fantastic for you guys to use in the classroom. And some of them are tearjerkers because they tell the story and it's wonderful. Like this one on the thirst in Africa is a lot about the burden of thirst. Is a lot about climate change and how, without water, it's not going well and everywhere. So I just wanted to point that out, that, it like all relationships, it goes like this. And I think now, there's a lot of synergy. Even in my classroom, I have students who come out and wanted to be, a academic in the classroom, but they realize now what their passion is science writing or even policy making, right? Because, these articles that get written get picked up by those who make policy decisions. They get picked up by the community, and they help drive where our future goes into these decision-making processes. So there's a lot of value that I think hasn't. I don't know what the right word is, but it's all that trust, right? It's all about trust, and if you once you screw it up, it's really hard to make it.
Right. Well, and thank you, Becky, for also noting these award-winning stories. Actually, many scientific societies are doing this now. The American Institute of Physics, the American Chemical Society, the National, just a variety, AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, has been giving awards for decades. And now they're also giving awards to scientists who have demonstrated great skills at communicating and engaging general audiences. So you can actually, depending on your own disciplines, your own training, you can check out societies and may find those kinds of stories. In addition, the professional journalism societies also give awards. So the National Association of Science Writers gives awards. The Society of Environmental Journalism gives awards. I think the health group, who I've forgotten the acronym. Julie, do you remember the acronym for the?
It's AHCJ. It's an Association for Health. Oh, that's one of them.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a lot of it. Think of it as peer review of science journalism.
Yeah.
And there are lots of ways to find good stories. So thanks for bringing that up, Becky.
Yeah. So I guess one question that I like to ask all of our Lunch and Learn speakers is, if you were, in middle school or in high school again, what would you tell that high school student? What kind of advice would you give them? Give yourself? Yeah.
Give myself, yes. Well, the main piece of advice I would have given myself is stop thinking about science as something that somebody else does. I wish that I had been allowed myself to be inspired by science, math, physics. I think I would have loved to have been an astronomer, for example, but I just didn't. And I don't want to blame anyone else, but there was certainly no encouragement in that direction. Parents teachers, I don't know, they're just, you didn't see a lot of effort to get folks going. Now, I mean, look at what's available to middle school, high school kids, science fairs, inspired teachers. I mean, it's just fabulous to look at the level of engagement that teachers attain now with their students. So I think if I were looking at, lecturing me back in middle school, it would have been, you're taking algebra, you like algebra, keep going, for heaven's sake, stick with it. Think about a science major once you get to college. So tell your kids that.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions?
I think Christy had one about a documentary.
I was just wondering if you had seen the new documentary that Miles O'Brien just put out.
Oh, for COVID?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Miles is a great science journalist. He
Yes.
worked for many years for CNN.
Oh.
And then, in fact, CNN back in the day had a whole team of science journalists. They had a whole team of environmental journalists. And then once the great collapse occurred, they cut all those people loose. And Miles then resurfaced, beginning to do things for the public broadcasting service. And it's been costly to him, if you recall. Remember when he was out, where was he, in the Philippines? And had a terrible accident and lost an arm. But he is just really doing wonderful work. And I thought that was a great documentary. Did you like it?
Yes, and I just love him. Anytime he's doing a story on PBS, I just tune right in.
Yep. Now, documentaries are high impact products. They're also incredibly expensive, and you don't, if you're a freelancer, if you're a self-employed science journalist, you don't do this on your own. Okay. You instead try to pitch ideas to places like PBS, to major media organizations. Again, they're getting them to fund someone they don't know is pretty unlikely. But if you've got a track record, you can sometimes then collaborate with others. So for example, here, this isn't science, but I just encountered information about a collaboration between the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, probably our most prestigious paper here in Wisconsin, and Frontline. And they have they're now collaborating on the vote debacle in Wisconsin of a couple weeks ago, where, again, you may recall, the governor tried to delay the primary vote. The Republicans balked at that and were able to secure the endorsement of the state and national Supreme Court to force people to either vote by absentee, and that proved to be entirely problematic. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of absentee votes were not recorded or not even sent, or risk the COVID-19 exposure and go to the polls. So there will be a documentary at some point.
Cool.
It's probably going to focus on something larger than just that incident, I would assume. But again, those collaborations are ways to be able to afford to do this kind of work.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you.
And Tanya, do you want to go ahead and ask yours? I think you're muted. There you go.
Well, if my husband could figure out how to do that, I'd never get a word in. My main thing is just when it comes to students doing research, the greatest challenge I have is them finding unbiased sources. Because like you all have been talking about, the media is so politically biased, either one extreme or the other. Are there any good, like, it's hard to say unbiased because there's really no such thing as being unbiased completely. But is there a good resource you would recommend for high school students when they're just initially learning something, like say nuclear power, or I'm covering the use of alternative energy? I mean, are there any good science resources that are fairly middle of the road, unbiased, just scientific?
The trick, I think, is to find, you know, evidence-based information that is that a young person can actually understand and process. What I would do initially is look in what I would call sort of popular science magazines.
Okay.
These are magazines that, again, they don't have, as best I can tell, I don't see an ideological focus. They're all about explaining things, and again, you notice my old-fashioned print orientation. There are probably online magazines as well that are focused on on explaining things. Those kinds of sites don't have an again, I think you're absolutely right to make the point that no one walks into a story without some belief systems about what's true and what isn't. What you hope is that those belief systems are grounded in evidence and not in ideology. And so I think, again, popular science sites tend to be places that concentrate on explaining science. And you don't see a whole lot of the ideology pieces in those. So I might look in places like that. They're geared to try to explain things to non-scientists. And I think for students in K-12, that's a great starting point. The person who's a fan of Scientific American does wonderful review articles. The scientists write the articles. They're then edited by journalists. So there is a small staff of journalists at Scientific American that edits what the scientists write. But that can be another place where you can find information that is evidence-based. It's going to be more complexly written than information in, say, a magazine like Discover or a trade magazine like Physics Today or something like that. But that's where I would start. We don't have ready access anymore to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Instead, what we have is Wikipedia, which actually has become a universal site for learning, and I think does tolerably well. Maybe some of you run into inaccuracies or big holes in its treatment of information, but I would not be surprised to find students spending a lot of their time there.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Julie and Becky, if you have any other site ideas for sites, this would be a good time to weigh in about how to help students learn.
Well, I've been posting some things on the chat as you mentioned them or whatever.
Yeah. I always find a society, like a scientific society, and sometimes they have stuff built in there for educators. I know in our mosquito society, they have stuff in there for educators that they can pull from. In my entomology society, they also have that available. So it's just, yeah, I guess this would be a different kind of way, but you go straight to the scientific society and hope that it's a good one. That's the hard part. It's, how do we teach critical thinking? It's really hard, trial and error.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Diane has posted some too. Chem Matters.
Yep, Chem Matters. There are a whole array of trade magazines that come out of scientific societies, and they are not just for the engineers or the biologists. They tend to try to write for a slightly broader array of audiences, so those can be good places.
Well, and podcasts too.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of you guys might know that this podcast will kill you. That's a fun one that I've been following for a while. And there's 2 versions of it now too, right? There's the one with their fancy drink, and then there's the one without the drink so that you guys can use it in the classroom. Like the quarantini. They were the ones who came up with the quarantini.
Oh dear, quarantini. It does remind me though that the challenge of evaluating online information is particularly great. And that's, of course, where students will go. They are not going to go to the library and haul things out of the stacks. And so trying to figure out how to help students evaluate what they see online, I think, is quite a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if any of you all in the room are good at this, but I'd love to hear about some of your strategies if you do engage in helping them.
Someone once gave me an article that claimed something. I happened to glance and see who the source of the article was, so I went and looked up the research they quoted, and the research was the exact opposite of what the article was claiming. So I had mine just go find the research and look that up.
Great idea. Great idea.
Yeah, I know I would say like June, I get an email from somebody at Reader's Digest asking me about plants and how plants can be used for mosquitoes and repellents and stuff. And if you plant around your yard and, in the advertising area for, I guess it would be horticulture or whatever that field is exactly, they're saying plant this and it'll, repel mosquitoes. And it's like, well, if you extract that one compound from it and then synthesize it with something else, yes, that will repel mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Good.
Y'all are going to have so much reading homework. I can't tell you how many hyperlinks and articles I've been sitting here furiously adding to the list.
Yes. More screen time, right?
Good thing summer's on its way, right?
I see somebody, Alicia uses Science News. That's been one of my go-to magazines for many years too. It's a thin little magazine, has been coming out since the 1930s. The editorial team is in Washington, D.C., and it is issued every other week. It used to be weekly, but every other week in hard copy. But it also does a lot of good stories on its website. So that's a great place to check.
Awesome. I saw a question about the willow tree. Nope. Sorry. If you want to attract mosquitoes, I suggest privet and honeysuckle.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Things that provide, sweet floral nectaries for not just your bees, but for your mosquitoes. All right. So if we don't have any more questions, I don't want to take up any more of Dr. Dunwoody's time. But thank you for coming and zooming in and meeting with us during this crazy time. I know we all appreciate it. Are there no more questions before take a small break? All right, awesome.
You guys have a lot more coming, don't you, at this point?
Just a smidge more, maybe another 30 minutes of butt in the seat behind the screen with our monitors and earphones. But again, thank you so much for talking with us.
Sure. You're welcome, and thank you all for listening. I appreciate your time and questions. So
yeah, there is clapping. Yeah, you can see the hands going up. It's just such a weird,
Thank you,
interesting format.
I'm out of here. Happy weekend, everybody.
Yes. Happy Saturday. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.